Good evening and welcome to all of you to this Sunday at the Abbey presentation. This year we're focusing on writing as a vocation and as a spiritual practice, and looking at it across the span of 6 presenters. So just really excited and pleased that it came together in this way. This evening we have the privilege of welcoming Dorothy Bass as a presenter. She directs the Valparaiso Project on the education and formation of people in faith. And the goal is to develop resources to help contemporary people live the Christian faith with integrity and vitality in, of course, a time of rapidly changing parameters. Front page of the Star Tribune today is another testimony to that particular change. The project has sponsored grant programs, seminars, books and conferences, and a variety of other tools for individuals and communities to use. Dorothy is the author of Receiving the Day, Christian Practices for Opening the Gift of Time, and the editor or co-editor of Practicing Our Faith, A Way of Life for a Searching People, Way to Live, Christian Practices for Teens, and On Our Way, Christian Practices for Living a Whole Life. With her husband, Mark Schwain, a professor of humanities at Valparaiso, she edited Leading Lives That Matter, What We Should Do and Who We Should Be. It's an anthology of poetry, classical texts, fiction, autobiography, all designed to really help a group of students with faculty guidance to drill down into the whole matter of living a purposeful life. And in fact, Mark and Dorothy are here this semester to do a revision of that book. Dorothy is a graduate of Wellesley College, Union Theological in New York, and Brown. And the title of her presentation is Words and the Word, the writer as seeker and servant. Please give a warm Collegeville welcome to Dorothy Bass.
Thank you, Abbot John, for that warm introduction, and also for welcoming me and Mark and to all the rest of the community as well, for welcoming us here this semester. This is our 3rd time in Collegeville, and we just love it here, and really appreciate the community that you are and that you offer. I have been writing most of my life, almost all of it, and actually so have you. School papers, thank you notes, letters of application or recommendation or love. Now emails, some trivial, but some quite substantive and thought-filled. And some of this writing has required disciplined practice. Here I'm thinking mostly of school papers, especially the kind written by people who go on to graduate school and see their written work grow from book reports into lengthy contributions to academic discourse. Talk about discipline. Academic papers are guided by rules of evidence and argumentation, and by pressures to set aside your own voice in favor of summaries, theses, and facts. It's worth noticing that the discipline required belongs to what is also called disciplines. History, say, or philosophy, or literary criticism. This is the writing practice I inhabited for the most professionally formative years of my life. Writing meant advancing arguments about the state of religion in America. That was not always very uplifting. Or reporting on historical themes and events in an impartial way. Then, as the abbot's introduction mentioned, a foundation summoned me out of my position as a church history professor to lead an effort that required me to write in a different way. The focus was to develop resources for readers, broadly considered, that would help them do practical and theological reflection on the way of life to which we're called in Christ. A historian should know a few things about that would be helpful, right? Well, maybe a few things, but not enough, I soon discovered, and mostly not the right kind of things. I began to realize I had a lot to learn about writing when I was working on Receiving the Day, Christian Practices for Opening the Gift of Time, a book that puts the contemporary sense of hurry, fragmentation, and overwork into conversation with practical wisdom from Christian traditions. I started with Sabbath, where I discovered resources powerful enough that my own practice began to change. And then there was the church year, whose richness I was beginning to discover and to understand after I married into Lutheranism, after a previous couple decades in low church Protestantism. But there was another unit of time I also needed to engage, and my deadline was rapidly approaching. I needed to reflect practically and theologically, not on the week or the year, but on the day, which is actually the span of time that can cause the most stress as it rushes by again and again. But where can you find wisdom about the rhythms of the day? That's a joke. You know the answer. You know the answer. This wisdom belongs to and is embodied by Benedictines. So I made a few calls, got in my car, drove a couple of hours to Our Lady of Grace Monastery in Beech Grove, Indiana. I had no previous real-life experience with monasticism. The first thing that struck me was a sign over the door from the reception area into the cloister. It said, "Seek God." Whoa, was that what I was here for? The second thing was the steadying, centering experience of having each day shaped by the rhythms of prayer. I found that very powerful. Where am I? Oh, and the third thing was the generous hospitality of my host, who set aside many hours to answer the questions I had come with, and who ended up stirring up other deeper questions within me as well. Over the course of a week, the first week in Advent, I began to see some of what Benedictine Christianity has to say about the day and about time more generally. But even more important, I began to realize that I was myself a seeker, not just a scholar taking notes on a historical tradition and its contemporary expression. And I also began to realize that my deepest desire for this particular book was to do my seeking partly on behalf of the other time-stressed people I hoped would read it. I realized that my writing could be a form of service to others. Seeking and serving. These were what could make writing a spiritual practice. In the years that followed, I continued to live on the boundary between academic writing and what I would call ecclesial writing. My academic formation and the requirements of that big foundation project continued to limit my sense of where I should seek and who I was writing for and who my writing would serve. But a few years ago, as that project was coming to an end, I came to Collegeville with a plan to write a book, summing up what I had learned in that big project, tentatively entitled Growing in Christ, Practical Wisdom for Formation in Faith. I planned chapters on wisdom, biblical imagination, Holy Communion, reconciliation, hymnody, and the various workshops in which non-monastics work out our salvation. This might have been a valuable book, but it was not to be. As soon as I settled into my office upstairs in the quad, I realized that everything on my proposed list of chapter titles actually came to a focus for me at one tender spot in my own life. And I began to wonder if I could find the courage, humility, and skill to delve into that tender place. I could go ahead and write a series of expository topical chapters, or I could dive directly into the deep end of the pool, seeing what wisdom, imagination, communion, and reconciliation I could find and be found by there. After all, it was in this deep place that I had done much of whatever growing in Christ I could claim. And it was also there that my continuing need for growth often flared up with special urgency. I decided to dive in. And rather than simply describing what my new point of focus was, I'd like to read you the opening pages of the manuscript I'm working on now. I'm sitting in an Adirondack chair made of spruce from the forest that presses in on this alpine village from every side. Mark and I have come from Chicago to this, his favorite place in the world, for our honeymoon. Today he's out hiking, his fly rod in hand. He'll be back soon, almost certainly with a few rainbow trout for tomorrow's breakfast. On my lap is Mark's only child, and on her lap is the book that has become our favorite in the 4 days since we arrived. Kata is almost 5 years old. In this moment, I can think of nothing I'd rather do than read this book to this lively, imaginative child. She leans forward into The Tale of Molly Whuppie, glancing up at me in knowing amusement whenever the overconfident giant in the story sets another of his nefarious schemes in motion. At last, by wit and courage, Molly defeats him for good. Satisfied, Kata and I lie back onto the warm, fragrant wood. I tilt my head to rest my cheek against her braided yellow hair, and our breathing falls into a shared rhythm, each breath longer than the last. This lapful of child, this communion with a little one for whom I already feel overwhelming love, brings a joy I have been seeking for years. I am at peace, and I can feel in the looseness of her limbs that she is too. But we are not alone. A white-haired gentleman, whom I have so far failed to notice, has been listening in on the story from a few yards away. When he spots an opening, he catches Kata's eye, smiles, and speaks to her in a grandfatherly way. I see that you and your mommy are both wearing the same t-shirt, he says. Hearing mommy, Kata bolts upright and turns to me with a look of confusion and distress. Her mommy is hundreds of miles away. What is this man talking about? Our breathing quickens and diverges, and my joy shatters into pieces. I do not want to speak to this man. I try to will him away. But Kata has been addressed, and she has turned to me for help, so I must answer for us both. I'm not her mother, I say. I'm her stepmother. As soon as I utter this ugly word, everything changes. Now her look is one of alarm. "You are not my stepmother," she cries. I can tell that stories she has heard are flashing through her mind. Stepmothers are wicked. Stepmothers are mean to little girls and boys. I try to comfort her, but I cannot say, "Of course, honey, you're right. I'm not your stepmother." All I can do is whisper, "Shh, shh, everything is okay," while I gather her again into my lap. She is not persuaded. Sobbing, she hides her face in my shoulder while I pat her back. I wish like crazy that Mark would return to show us his catch and turn this day in a new direction. It soon becomes obvious that the white-haired gentleman is also distressed. He never intended to upset this child, and he is deeply sorry to have made her cry. He mumbles an apology and walks away. His sorrowful demeanor, I suspect, reflects a deeper concern as well. He is sad that a child so young has had to endure the breakup of her original home. He doesn't say this, but this is what I glimpse on his face. Or what I think I glimpse, perhaps because I have suddenly had that same thought. How sad for Kata that her parents have divorced. Caught up in my own new love, I have been papering over the loss suffered by this little girl. I've been kidding myself, I realize. I don't belong here in this chair with this book, holding this child. Kata should not be on my lap, but on the lap of her mother, the woman who gave her birth, the woman with whom she has previously traveled to this place. An aunt, teacher, or babysitter might be acceptable as a temporary substitute, I suppose, but not a stepmother, a woman whose very presence proves that Kata's young life has already been marred by grief. A woman who is possibly a homewrecker, probably a witch, and surely an interloper. A woman in whose body the terrible truth that families are fragile takes on flesh. Now, I'm tempted to stop here at the end of this personal story, since most people, including me, tend to like stories best. I admit I'm also drawn to that stopping point because I really like that final sentence fragment. But I'm going to continue reading a little further as the writing backs off from my personal experience to introduce a wider view. Here we go. In the 30-some years since that summer day, I have experienced the joy, sorrow, and confusion of stepmothering countless times. Happily, the joy has come most often. But I'm pretty sure that one reason the joy could surface is that I have learned to acknowledge the confusion and sorrow that have also been present from the very beginning in the family Mark and I have made together. The confusion is fueled in part by long-standing cultural images, of course, but confusion has also arisen in my own heart as fantasies of maternal fulfillment implode, as strangers make assumptions about my marriage, and as I try to figure out where I fit in the life of someone I love and often care for in mother-like ways, but whose mother I am not. And sorrow? A peaceful summer afternoon can come to an abrupt and tearful end, I have learned. Those of us who choose partners who are already parents step into relationships with children and adults who have experienced loss in the very part of life we now share with them. Someone has died. Someone has divorced. those who will come to be among our closest kin have been plunged into grief before we ever showed up. Their stories are many and diverse, and in more than a few cases, I believe the end of whatever came before was a good thing. Divorce can bring liberation from terrible situations, and I am grateful for myself and others that divorce is an option. Still, I can't shake the conviction that the world would be a better place if every child had two constant parents who loved each other and that child all their lives long. In such a world, there would be no kids shuttling back and forth, no tense relationships between a first spouse and a second, but that is not the world we live in. In some imagined world where neither persons nor marriages die, there are no stepmothers. In the real world, stepmothers are everywhere, with almost 400,000 new ones added to the total each year in the United States alone. This one statistic offers a glimpse into how fluid families are today and how rapidly they are changing. 1/3 of all American children under 18 are or have been part of a stepfamily. And 42% of all American adults have at least one close step relative. And yet how we understand our hopes and duties as family members has not kept pace with reality. Okay, now, that's the manuscript, back to now. The book I'm writing contains lots of personal stories, but it's not a memoir. Social research, history, folklore, popular culture, and more are woven in at many points. By backing off from my own experience on many of the pages, I hope not just to welcome others into my stories, but to encourage them to ponder their own. I also provide information that sets stepmothering in a wider context, in the hope of reaching readers who are, know, or have stepmothers, to understand the gifts and challenges inherent in this role. Developing these parts of the book engage me once again in the familiar discipline of research and renew my appreciation for the knowledge it creates and provides. And yet, it's clear that my own location and experience matter profoundly, as I invite readers to reflect on some painful and some joyful things. I've struggled, and I still struggle in certain sections, to find a voice that will show me to be worthy of readers' trust, empathetic toward those in various stepfamily roles, reliable as a guide to a good deal of information, and finally, morally persuasive, since my overriding hope is to encourage readers to embrace an intrinsically difficult vocation with generosity and grace. Still, developing that personal voice is tricky. I recently stumbled onto a short essay by the writer Joan Didion. It's called Why I Write. And Didion writes, "Of course, I stole the title for this talk from George Orwell. One reason I stole it was that I like the sound of the words, why I write. There you have three short, unambiguous words that share a sound, and the sound they share is this, I. In many ways, writing is the act of saying I. This is still Didion. Of imposing oneself upon other people, of saying, listen to me, see it my way, change your mind. You can disguise it with qualifiers and tentative subjunctives, with ellipses and evasions, but there's no getting around the fact that setting words on paper is the tactic of a secret bully. An invasion, an imposition of the writer's sensibility on the reader's most private space. So, I think it's time to get more directly to the topic of Sunday at the Abbey when you hear something like that, and to talk about spiritual practice. For me, spiritual practice entails clearing away the debris of distraction, fear, and self-regard that separate us from God and all God's creation, so that we may see, and maybe even write about, God, others, and ourselves more truly. It takes a kind of discipline. As a Christian who is trying to write, I find Didion's I disturbing. Though, in her defense, I should say that later in the essay, she tells how another kind of discipline, the kind excellent writers exercise in crafting language, can temper the damage. But more importantly, her it's convicting. It makes me realize the noisy presence of my own I. Is there any way that writing can actually become a way of saying we? A way of saying thou? Maybe. But I suspect that can only happen if along the way we engage in spiritual struggles similar to those that take place in other parts of life. Self-regard and its companion, caring too much what other people think of you, often lead me wrong in life, and they also threaten to infect the words I put on the page. For example, I feel challenged by something like this at this very moment, as I stand in front of a Roman Catholic audience and tell you something you may not have known. Mark and I, we two whom you have welcomed so warmly over many years, are divorced and remarried, and actually quite happily so. How will knowing this change your view of us and the views of similar readers I may have in the future? Another challenge comes from a more secular direction. Many people, including some I hold dear, would rather not hear me say that divorce and remarriage matter as much as I think they do. As I've been writing about being a stepmother, some people have asked, what's the big deal? Everybody knows families are changing like crazy now. These objectors would rather forget, after a brief period of mourning, the deaths from which stepfamilies are born and the ongoing reconciliation stepfamily life requires. Why do I assume people are so judgy? Am I being judgy too? One more example of one of these challenges, but this one I think suspects writers of every kind, including those who write school papers, thank you notes, and email. I'm often besieged by doubt that I can pull this off. It's hard. Can I write well enough? Some days I even have to ask, can I write at all? I just sit there procrastinating. That old familiar feeling of inadequacy raises its head here as elsewhere in life. Writing requires enough audacity to believe that what you're saying deserves a reader's attention, and enough humility to admit that your first draft and your 10th will still require revision, and that even after revisions, many people and most publishers are not going to be interested anyway. If writing is a spiritual practice, I am a seeker within that practice, a pilgrim who's not there yet, but who is struggling on, trying to avoid misleading byways, hoping that the jumble of experience and imagination and research and desire strewn across my desk will eventually arrange itself into a legible pattern. It's hard work sitting there rearranging all those paragraphs and sentences. But sometimes, as if by gift, connections emerge. In her famous essay on school studies and the desire for God, Simone Weil writes of the waiting involved in writing. We take up a way of writing, she says, a way of waiting, she says, when we are writing, for the right word to come of itself at the end of our pen, while we merely reject all inadequate words. When a word or section falls into place, my soul shouts, "Eureka!" But then, quieting down, I realize that some insight, some harmony has found me, and not I it. This is the seeking that belongs to writing as a spiritual practice. And in this spiritual practice, I hope I'm also a servant. This practice is so hard, so demanding, I don't think I could keep pressing on if I didn't think it was doing something good for someone besides myself. And aside, writing about this particular topic, of course, there's also the possibility of doing harm, even within my own family. So that's another particular thing here. I do try to think, do no harm. But beyond that, of course, I want to serve stepmothers as they struggle to live out an important vocation that is widely disdained. And I hope that those who have or care about stepmothers will read over their shoulders. If you think about it, reading has become one of the main practices by which Americans today perform their spirituality, explore their deepest questions, and search for God and for ways of life that are touched by God. Book groups and book sales are growing. Participation in Sunday worship is declining. This may be especially so for the readers I most hope to serve, and for the very same reason that it's difficult for me to stand here and tell you that I'm divorced and remarried. This reality creates for me a conundrum. Every insight or potentially helpful idea that I have to offer has emerged from my own understanding and experience of Christian faith. Meanwhile, many of the readers I hope to reach are unfamiliar with Christian language, and more than a few are hostile to it. My most daunting challenge as a writer is to depict a way of life that I see as imbued with the truth of the gospel in language that is open, even attractive to those who do not believe. This is a matter of service to the neighbor. What language shall I borrow? In the passage I read a few minutes ago, I suppressed explicitly religious language because at that point in the manuscript, I was trying to welcome people in. I'd like to close by reading a passage that is framed somewhat differently. In preparation, let me just tell you a few things. My stepdaughter and my husband do not appear in this scene. Instead, the key characters are Kata's mother, whose name is Ricky, and my biological daughter, born later, Martha, who's 15 about or so at the time of the story I'm going to read. Martha's twin brother is also briefly mentioned. Here I put our step's family situation in the larger context of the brokenness of the entire world, of creation, of society, and also in the context of the overarching reconciliation across these realms that God both promises and provides. The setting is a mountaintop in the North Cascade Mountains, near that same village where the white-haired gentleman once disrupted Kata's and my afternoon. Every August, the Perseid meteor shower rains streams of light across the skies of the northern hemisphere. Most years I forget to look or can't see anything even if I remember, as city lights dilute the darkness and render the fast-moving flashes invisible. But sometimes this natural wonder occurs while I am at Holden. That's what happened the summer I traveled there with a group of teenagers, including my twins. Mark and Kata, by this time in her 20s, had returned to the Midwest to prepare for fall semester at their separate universities. But Ricky was still there, volunteering on Holden's short-term staff. My friend Ingrid was hosting another group at Holden during that August week. Ingrid had raised funds to bring a dozen women from her Chicago neighborhood on a visit to this strange village so far from the urban world they knew. These guests were residents of Genesis House, a ministry that supports women in regaining their independence after years of tough living on the city streets. These women were poor. Most were Black. Some were illiterate. Their life experiences were quite different from those of the youngsters in my charge. I was pleased when Ingrid suggested we get our groups together. We decided to take a star hike, Holden lingo for a late-night walk beyond the village limits into star-revealing darkness. So after Vespers, we rounded up a stack of yard blankets and a box of flashlights and met at the edge of the village. A few others joined us too. One of these was Ricky. Everyone fell into companionable pairs and trios as we started to trudge up the steep trail leading to the top of a huge pile of tailings produced years before by the now defunct mine. Though a few of the youngsters sprinted, it took a while, maybe half an hour, for everyone to get up there. Many of the Chicago women moved tentatively. The darkness, uncompromised by street lights, was spooky, they said. And so were the noises coming from the forest. But as we moved beyond the trees onto the top of the huge, barren pile of wasted rock, everyone gasped. I haven't seen this many stars since I was a little girl in Mississippi, my companion murmured in amazement. Looking down, we saw the village 1,000 feet below, a faint circle of light twinkling in the valley's vast darkness. Moving slowly, everyone took a blanket, spread it on the ground, and lay down to gaze upward. Every now and then, a meteor flared across the heavens, and several times we simultaneously breathed an appreciative ah. Mostly, though, we were silent together as we settled one by one into our own reflective solitudes. When all were still, the voices of two women broke the silence. One voice, young and strong, bore the accents of the Pacific Northwest. The other, older, incorporated rhythms rooted in the Deep South. Alternating verse by verse, these voices recited a psalm in the midst of this unusual assembly. Sun and moon, glittering stars, sing praise, sing praise. Highest heavens, rain clouds, sing praise, sing praise. Praise God's name, whose word called you forth and fixed you in place forever by eternal decree. God's splendor above the earth, above the heavens, gives strength to the nation, glory to the faithful. I'm not sure how long we remained under that star-streaked sky, side by side on the yard blankets. But as I lay there, I became aware of a startling paradox. I was on top of a massive, toxic scar on the face of the earth. And I was also surrounded by beauty beyond human imagining. A few decades before, human beings had wrecked the land beneath us. They had made money, but I had benefited too, as a place of retreat became available to me. But the earth had paid a price. Fish no longer swam in the river, and deer could not drink from it. Even so, it seemed to me, as clear as the stars themselves, that God still loved this land and these creatures, including us, including me. With the psalmist I rejoiced, praise the Lord across the heavens from the heights. Blessed be this strong darkness, these streaming lights, this silence. Blessed be God's creative power and God's promise to make all things new. Finally, an impulse to share my awe led me to sit up and look around. What I saw overwhelmed me in a different way. My daughter, Martha, was lying nearby, serenely sharing her blanket with two women. On her right was a woman who was striving to overcome immense hardship in a city near our home. On her left was Ricky, her father's first wife. So much brokenness was gathered right in front of me. The failed marriage, the difficult stepfamily, the suffering long borne by a resolute woman whose name I didn't know. And on the same blanket was this girl of my own heart, so fresh, so delighted by this midnight outing, and undeniably so vulnerable to the same kinds of brokenness the women on both sides of her had already experienced. But I could also see in this very same glance that all the brokenness gathered there was being overcome in that moment, as these three shared an old blanket, heard some ancient words, and witnessed a display of cosmic beauty. That night has stayed with me as a foretaste of the healing of the world, the healing of creation, the healing of divisions of race and class, the healing of broken families. For me, this was a glimpse of the really real, a moment when the reconciliation I believe God intends for all became visible. As I continued to ponder this night over the years, the words of the Apostle Paul have merged with this memory. So if anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. Everything old has passed away. See, everything has become new. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting the message of reconciliation to us. Change gears. It took me a long time to figure out why that night shone so brightly in my memory. Sitting at my desk, writing a sentence, deciding it was no good, deleting it and trying again, I was a seeker. If I had not sat still for a long time, trying to find the words that could make that moment vivid and clear on the page, I would not have made any of the connections that now feel so important. Creation and new creation, beauty, justice, and love, the great big cosmos and the frail little family. Within the spiritual practice of writing, I became a seeker. And whenever I found a few words that seemed right and good, I felt that those words had actually come as a gift. But will this passage serve others in the way I hope? Is there still so much I that readers might never find a we there? I don't know. I'm still working on this. In particular, I wonder whether I should include the passage from 2 Corinthians, a passage I love, and I suspect you do too, but which may present an obstacle to those who resist the sway of the church and its scriptures. Such freighted language might even prevent them from opening themselves to the promise and possibility of reconciliation. If I'm thinking as a servant, trying, say, to reach out to the members of step families who have rejected the church and its language even more than the public at large, perhaps I should stop here For me, this was a glimpse of the really real, a shimmering moment when the peace and justice I believe God intends for all became visible. So I continue to seek, and I hope to serve. Thank you. All right.
Hi. Well, I have a few questions, but
Hi.
the one, I'm very struck by this idea of the we and the thou. And I don't know if you can ever know who they are. So I think, speaking as a writer, I just wonder, too much of kind of one worrying about the audience could be a real barrier to being able to tell the story the way it's really revealed itself to you.
That's helpful. Yeah.
And I think also maybe being a person who has written about religion in a different context, trying to both open that audience, but realize that the religious audience or the spiritual audience is much larger probably than you think. I mean, I wonder, I think there are a lot of people who still respond to spiritual and even classically religious language in a personal context who would be willing to follow you. So
I hope so. Thank you.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's a really important project, and I hope that you get it out there
Thank you.
and keep doing
Thank
it.
you. Let me follow up though on this
Yeah.
we and thou.
Yeah.
You know when you go I, and you think, could it be we? Could it be thou? Have you thought about, there still must be at least craft choices you can make that open up the I a little bit more so that others at least could walk in if they want to. And you might never know if they did. Or if, you know, it would kind of be a mystery. You probably have thought about this too, Kathleen. But you know, there must be way. I do feel like occasionally I read something and it's so about that person.
I think
another-
actually already well, I have written, religious poems, and when I was sitting listening to it, I was definitely thinking, I faced a lot of unexpected resistance to that language or, open hostility or whatever. But I still deeply believe in the truths
Yes.
that I uncovered in that writing. And I think your truths about reconciliation and brokenness are well worth communicating through the way that you have discovered them in your own experience.
Okay.
So I guess I feel like it goes beyond the I when it's not just about feeling sympathy or even empathy for the person who's speaking, but actually touching on deeper truths,
Okay.
which I think that you are more than capable and actually demonstrating that you are doing.
Thanks. Of course, my deepest hope would be that people would say, "Wow, this is what Christianity is. Let's go. I mean, this is awesome." There's a certain, but I don't want to do that too strongly either. Because it's about what it's about. Yeah. So.
I just said to Kathleen, wow, I taught out of your other books and I know your material so well, and to hear this whole other piece
Thanks.
is so exciting. And my response of how do I open up the I to the we is the gift of the classical language out of 2 Corinthians.
Okay.
Because I am envisioning a kid from Washington State, Los Holden Village. I am envisioning this young teenager lying between these two women, one who she knows so well because of marriage, and one who is unknown but clearly the other in terms of life experience. And as you've drawn me into that story, you've taken me away from you, and then you give me language that jarred me into thinking about reconciliation in my family.
Okay.
And the gift of that classical language all of a sudden allows me to come into the story out of
Good.
my own story.
Yeah. Thanks.
And also the Corinthians passage, I think you've earned the right to use it. It's because you're revealing a lot of personal things that a lot of people can relate to, and somebody reading it who is not Christian or doesn't care about religion, oh, this means something to her. I mean, and that might be all they think about it, but it's not. And you're saying that it really means something to her. That's interesting, or maybe they want to know more about it, maybe they don't, but you've earned the way into it in a way by telling the personal story, and they think this passage means this to me, and that's an open door.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All the while you were giving your talk, I think the word listening came to me quite often. You listen well. And whether you started out with, when you went to Beech Grove, if the sisters talked to you about, that's the first thing that Benedict says in the rule is to listen.
Yes.
And to that child, listening is the most peaceful thing you can give to anybody,
Yeah.
whether they're 5 or 95. And I think you, if you develop that part of it in the spiritual giving and taking from each other, and I suspect that the same thing happened in the second time of marriage. The two of you are listening to each other in a way that didn't happen before, and that's not, putting any, whatever. But
Yes.
listening is part of what you do very well with.
Thank you.
And if you could somehow or another put that into your writing, how people listen to one another.
All right, that's helpful. Thanks. Thank you. Good.
So I met you in 2005, 2006 when we were in residence, and you were writing about, you were trying to write about staying at home and about being in a rooted place, stability. But you said that everywhere in the Bible, everybody was just nomads and Jesus was just on the move all the time and there was no stability to be found anywhere, which struck me very powerfully. And now you're saying that you came to write one book and you ended up writing a totally different book. And I'm wondering if there's something about Collegeville and the type of exploration outside of your own academic institution or whatever in a different context that allows you to seek in a different way.
Yes, that's a good question. The way I would put that not just stability thing was that so often in Scripture, transformation takes place on the road to Damascus, on the wandering in the wilderness, right? While you're traveling, that's when transformation often comes. And so coming to this community of stable people, transformation could happen to me. I'm sort of on the road, and getting out of that. Actually, you mentioned both the previous times I've been at Collegeville, I have done a different project than what I proposed and was accepted to do. But I did projects. I mean, I've been productive, But I think there may be something. I don't know if some of you noticed. I've been at morning prayer most weekday mornings. This first time I've been that regular, and I've found that such a wonderful way to start the day. I'm going to miss it so much when I get home. I have to figure out. It's just not the same sitting in my little chair by myself, you know? And I'm going to have to figure that out. So there may be some way in which, so to say that I'm a seeker and I'm a servant in my writing work, that makes sense here in a really clear way, you know? And I want to be able to see that at home as well. It's a little, you know, you get enmeshed in your own home, but yeah. Thank you for that insight, though.
So you heard the word listening. I heard the word struggle a number of times in your talk, and they were at different places along the way, and they were in different contexts. So I could phrase the question this way. How is struggle related to writing as a spiritual practice?
Well, that's a good question, and I think I never realized I used the word that much, but yes, I did, didn't I? Yes, yeah. Okay, so I came here in 2014 to write this kind of quasi-academic book. I changed my mind. I decided at the age of 65 or whatever I was to try to become a writer. I had written several books, but I was not a writer. And that meant like going back to school and and writers in their practices do a lot of criticism of each other, right? I mean, and I've been taking classes as if I were 21. It feels great. It's great, but learning is struggle in that way, right? You have to let go of the expertise. And I go to creative writing classes and really I just kind of humble myself and try to learn as much as possible. And it's a struggle because it's really hard to do it well. I think that there's something in the just struggling, for example, with the views that others have of me as a stepmother. You know, I have a whole chapter called Owning the Ugly Word. And I've decided to stay with the ugly word instead of picking some kind of soft ones, and to try to redeem it. So that's a struggle. I mean, there are struggles intrinsic in the material, but I think some of the struggles I was referring to is just the struggle to make this paragraph work, you know? How do you get through? How do I get to the end of this chapter? You know, that kind of thing has been struggle as well. Occasionally there's something where I come upon a truth and I really have to think, whoa, do I want to go there? So one way I'm dealing with the thing of writing about my other family members, writing stories in which they appear, is that I've adopted this voice where I do not know anything except what I know and what I knew. So if somebody says something ridiculous to me in my family, one of my stories, you know, I don't know what they were really thinking. And I say on the page, I do not know what she meant. Here's what I thought she meant, but she could have meant this other thing. And even that unpacking that is kind of interesting. You know, thinking out loud about how you interpret. A lot of this is about interpreting wounds and slights. Believe me, you enter the blogosphere of the stepmother world. There are very few people responding in any kind of generous and forgiving way to even the smallest slight. And, you know, and this situation is very potentially full of them, whether from within the family or from outside, from the culture.
Yeah, just one very short additional word. Because when you talk about God in relationship to your writing, you talk about God in relationship to your sense of servanthood. You want to be of service. Also in relationship to the gift of words, the gift of language, God, the giver. I'm just wondering if God is there in the struggle, even at the very beginning when things are kind of inchoate. They're causing you enough distress to move from this idea to this idea. It's not necessarily that I need an answer to this. It's an observation that I wonder if the struggle itself is deeply involved
Mm-hmm.
with your relationship with God throughout your entire life that led you to this point.
Maybe, but, and that's very possible, and I will listen for that in my experience. I am much more likely in my own piety and in my thinking about how I learn and change to think about the cross. I mean, I have to, every time I go to God, I have to go back through Jesus again. It's really hard for me just to do God. I can get there through Jesus every day, you know, but I can't just do this big thing quite as easily. So that one of my favorite little things I can only use once in the book, it's difficult, but is that being the position of the stepmother is really crucial. It's really important, makes a big difference. You can be a force for good, a force for ill. But it's also crucial in the sense of it's a cross. It's a place of pain, a place where some kind of death will probably be required of you. It could be the death of resentment. It could be the death of jealousy. It could be the death of, desiring something that is not on offer. As long as you're going for something that's not on offer and it's dying. I mean, there are some other good things that are on offer, and that's great. So thanks. I'll think about God. I more often think about Christ. Does that make sense? Sorry, but that's true.
And I've been thinking throughout your talk and in this discussion, a person that you're reminding me of is Sister Jeremy Hall, who was a sister at St. Benedict.
Oh.
And I used to go to her for spiritual mentoring. And she, I believe, had a PhD from Creighton. She was a college professor. And she said, when you're writing, in that world, you master things. You get a master's
Yes,
degree.
that's
You're
right.
mastering things. And then she had moved beyond that to just some personal writing, a lot of spiritual reflection, and the ability to say, I don't know. You said, I don't know what someone means. You see, in the academic world, you're not allowed to do that. You're supposed to be sure of things, right?
Yeah.
And what you're doing is really moving into this other kind of writing, where you can say, I don't know, and you can say there's a death here, and you can say these things. It's just a very, very different kind of writing. But I remember just I was thinking a lot about Sister Jeremy, and she said, yes, I mastered a subject. Isn't that just funny? I mean, she just,
Right.
and now I can let all that go.
Yes.
And that's what she did. But I think you're moving in that direction, certainly.
Yeah, it's very exciting. It's my retirement project, and it makes me feel younger and better because it's something new, and I'm learning all the time, and I'm growing. So that's really fun. Yes.
So much.
Oh, you're welcome.